The security camera footage at St. Jude's Medical Center captured the exact moment everything shattered. 1 second, it was a routine Friday night, the kind that lulled even seasoned ER staff into a fragile sense of control. The next, a 300-pound security guard was airborne, thrown across the waiting room like a discarded rag doll. The impact sent chairs skidding, magazines exploding into the air, and terrified screams ripping through the comm. The aggressor followed immediately. A 7-foot giant, red-faced and roaring in a language that barely sounded human, tore through the emergency room doors as if they were made of thin plastic instead of reinforced glass. The automatic sensors never had time to react. He didn't slow down. He didn't hesitate. He charged forward on pure momentum and rage. Doctors froze mid-step. Nurses stared, brains lagging behind instinct. Patients clutched 4 poles and loved ones, scrambling backward with nowhere to go. Someone screamed for security, not realizing security was already crumpled on the floor, unmoving. Police were minutes away. Minutes the ER didn't have. The only thing standing between that unstoppable force and a room full of vulnerable people was Elle Bennett. She was 5'2". A rookie. On her 3rd shift. Her badge still looked too clean. Her scrubs were slightly oversized, the sleeves bunching at her wrists. To anyone watching, she looked out of place, like she had wandered into a disaster by mistake. More than one person later admitted they thought she was about to die. They were wrong. Just moments earlier, the emergency room had been humming with its usual controlled chaos. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, casting everything in that pale, unforgiving glow unique to hospitals. It was 10:15 p.m. on a Friday night, a time veteran staff referred to as the witching hour. The moment when happy hour drunks became overdose patients, when domestic arguments spilled out of apartments and into trauma bays. Elle Bennett had been standing near the nurse's station, quietly checking a vitals monitor for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. Her movements were small, precise, almost careful. She had learned quickly that drawing attention to herself never ended well. "Stop fidgeting, Bennett," came the sharp voice of Brenda Miller, the charge nurse. "You're making the patients nervous." Elle had murmured an apology, eyes down, hands steady despite the words. To Brenda, Elle was just another traveler nurse filling a temporary gap. To the doctors, she was an easy joke. To the residents, barely noticeable. No one in that room knew where she had been before St. Jude's. No one knew what her hands had done before they learned to hang 4 bags. As the giant's roar echoed off the walls and glass shattered across the floor, instinct finally caught up with reality. People moved. People ran. Fear took over. Elle didn't. She lifted her eyes, heart slowing instead of racing, and took in the scene with unsettling clarity. The fallen guard. The screaming patients. The distance between herself and the monster tearing into the ER. And somewhere deep inside her, something old and disciplined clicked into place. The calm before the storm was over. But for Elle Bennett, the real work had just begun. Before the chaos arrived, before glass shattered and screams filled the air, Elle Bennett was already fighting a quieter battle. The fluorescent lights of St. Jude's emergency room hummed overhead, casting everything in a pale, clinical glow that never quite let you forget where you were. It was the kind of light that flattened faces, erased warmth, and made even healthy people look tired. To Elle, that sound and that light had become a rhythm she followed carefully, step by step, like walking across thin ice. It was 10:15 p.m. on a Friday night. The witching hour. Veteran nurses knew it well. It was the moment when the ER shifted gears, when laughter from earlier in the evening dissolved into groans, sirens, and raised voices. Happy hour drunks turned belligerent. Quiet apartments became crime scenes. The night stopped being predictable. Elle adjusted her scrub top again, tugging it down even though it was already too big for her. Standing at just over 5 feet tall, with narrow shoulders and a frame that looked more suited for a college library than a trauma bay, she knew how she appeared to others. She felt their glances linger, assessing, dismissing. She checked the vitals monitor once more, eyes scanning numbers she already knew by heart. Oxygen saturation. Heart rate. Respiratory rhythm. Everything mattered, even when no one seemed to notice her watching. "Stop fidgeting, Bennett." The voice cut through the air with surgical precision. Brenda Miller didn't raise her voice. She never had to. At 50 years old, with decades in emergency medicine etched into her posture, she commanded the room without effort. Brenda had survived epidemics, gang violence, hospital mergers, and administrators with clipboards. Her tolerance for nerves was non-existent. Elle flinched only slightly. "Sorry, Brenda," she murmured, eyes still on the chart. "I just noticed Mr. Henderson's O2 saturation dipping a little." "It's dipping because he's 90 and holding his breath every time you hover," Brenda snapped. "Go prep bed 4. Dr. Reynolds needs a catheter setup. And don't mess it up like the last rookie." Elle nodded and swallowed the reply that rose to her throat. She had learned quickly that pride was expensive in places like this. She could hear the laughter drifting from down the hall. Dr. Reynolds, confident and polished, surrounded by residents who fed off his approval. Earlier, she had overheard him joking about her. "She looks like a high school volunteer. If a code gray comes in, what's she going to do?" politely asked the meth head to sit down. They gave her 2 weeks. Maybe less. Elle kept her head down and her hands steady. Silence was easier than arguing. Silence let people underestimate her. What they didn't know was where she had been before St. Jude's. They didn't know why loud voices didn't rattle her, or why chaos sharpened her focus instead of blurring it. They didn't know why her hands never shook, even when alarms screamed and blood soaked the floor. They saw the rookie badge. They saw her size. They filled in the rest themselves. As Elle walked toward bed 4, the ER doors hissed softly somewhere behind her. Cold air slipped inside, carrying the smell of rain and the distant echo of sirens. Something in her chest tightened, not with fear, but with awareness. The night was changing. And while everyone else joked, rushed, or dismissed her presence, Elle Bennett moved quietly through the ER, unaware that in just moments, every assumption about her would be shattered beyond repair. The first warning wasn't a sound. It was a vibration. A low, almost subsonic tremor that rippled through the floor tiles beneath Elle Bennett's sneakers, so faint most people would never have noticed it. Elle did. Her steps slowed. Her head lifted slightly, instincts sharpening as her eyes drifted away from bed 4 and toward the main sliding doors of the ambulance bay. Something was wrong. At the security desk, Mike Cogan, Big Mike to everyone who worked nights, looked up from his monitor. Boredom drained from his face in an instant, replaced by confusion, then something far rarer on a man like him, fear. At 6'4" and built like a former linebacker, which he was, Mike had handled knife-wielding psych patients and violent drunks without breaking a sweat. This was different. "Unit 1 to dispatch," Mike said into his radio, his voice tight. I don't know what I've got. There's a vehicle coming in hot down the ambulance lane." Elle stopped walking. The vibration grew stronger. Through the glass doors, headlights appeared where they shouldn't have been, cutting through the rain at an unnatural speed. "It's not an ambulance," Mike added, standing now, one hand hovering near the taser on his belt. In the trauma bay, Dr. Reynolds was barking orders, adrenaline already fueling his voice. Monitors beeped. A gurney rolled past. No one else was paying attention. "Brenda," Elle said quietly, turning back toward the nurse's station. "Not now, Bennett." Brenda snapped without looking up. "I'm busy." Elle didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Look at the monitors," she said, pointing, not to the medical screens, but to the security feed mounted high above the desk. Brenda glanced up. On the grainy black and white screen, a black SUV smashed through the metal bollards at the entrance of the ambulance bay. The impact sent sparks flying. Steam poured violently from the crumpled hood as the vehicle screeched to a halt. The driver's door didn't open. It was kicked. The metal bent outward, hanging crookedly from its hinges, and then the man stepped out. Even on the small screen, he didn't look real. He was massive, his frame stretching the limits of the camera's view. A torn gray hoodie clung to muscles that moved like hydraulic pistons beneath his skin. Rain poured over him, plastering fabric to flesh, but he didn't seem to feel it. He tilted his head back and screamed, a sound the camera couldn't capture, but somehow everyone in the room felt deep in their bones. "Who is that?" Dr. Reynolds asked, pausing mid-command. Elle's eyes narrowed. "That," she said softly, "is a problem." The man didn't walk toward the doors. He charged. 20 yards vanished in seconds. Big Mike stepped forward, authority snapping into place. "Sir, stop right there. This is a restricted area." The automatic doors didn't open fast enough. The giant didn't slow down. He lowered his shoulder and slammed into the glass. The sound was explosive, like a gunshot echoing through the ER. Tempered glass shattered into a million glittering fragments, raining across the linoleum. Alarms seemed to fade beneath the sudden, terrible silence that followed. Through the broken frame, the intruder stepped inside. Up close, he was even worse. 7 feet tall, skin flushed an angry red, veins standing out like cords along his neck. His pupils were blown so wide his eyes looked like black pits. Foam gathered at the corners of his mouth as he breathed in harsh, animal bursts. This wasn't just a drunk. This wasn't just a junkie. This was something far more dangerous. And as fear finally surged through the ER, Elle Bennett felt the last pieces fall into place. The monster had arrived. Big Mike didn't hesitate. The moment the giant crossed the threshold of shattered glass, Mike Cogan stepped into the center of the hallway, planting his feet wide like a man bracing against a storm. Years of instinct took over. He raised his taser, arms steady, voice loud enough to cut through the rising screams. "Freeze! Get on the ground!" The giant didn't even acknowledge him. He looked straight through Mike, as if the 6'4" former lineman was nothing more than furniture. His chest heaved, muscles flexing beneath torn fabric, veins bulging along his neck like thick cords ready to snap. "Last warning!" Mike shouted. He fired. The taser prong struck the giant square in the chest. Wires snapped tight. 50,000 volts crackled through the air, the sharp electrical pop echoing off the ER walls. It was a charge designed to drop a grown man instantly, to lock muscles and shut down movement. For half a second, everyone believed it had worked. Then the giant looked down at his chest. No convulsing. No collapse. He reached up calmly, wrapped one massive hand around the wires, and ripped the barbs out of his own flesh as if plucking loose threads from a shirt. Blood trickled down the front of his hoodie. He smiled, a broken, red-smeared grin that sent a wave of cold dread through the room. "Mike, run," Elle whispered, her voice barely audible. The giant moved. He crossed the distance in a blur and backhanded Big Mike with casual indifference, like swatting an insect. The impact lifted the guard clean off his feet. For a terrifying second, Mike was airborne, arms flailing, before he slammed into the triage desk. Monitors exploded. Plastic shattered. Mike crumpled to the floor, unconscious. The ER erupted. Patients screamed and scrambled from gurneys, tripping over 4 lines. A mother dragged her child behind a chair. Someone sobbed uncontrollably near the wall. Dr. Reynolds, pale and wide-eyed, backed away clutching a clipboard like a shield, his earlier confidence evaporating in an instant. Code Gray. Code Silver. Brenda screamed into the phone, her hands shaking for the first time in decades. "Get the police here now." The giant stood amid the wreckage, breathing hard, surveying the room like a predator choosing its next target. His gaze locked onto the trauma bay where the unconscious overdose patient lay. Elle, he bellowed. He wasn't calling for the nurse. He was calling for the patient. And in that instant, Elle Bennett understood two things with absolute clarity. First, this man wasn't here to escape or intimidate, he was here to kill. Second, no one else in the room was capable of stopping him. While doctors retreated and nurses froze, Elle did the opposite. She reached into her pocket and unclipped her penlight, fingers moving with deliberate calm. She inhaled slowly, forcing her heart rate down, shutting out the screaming, the broken glass, the chaos. Then she stepped forward. "Hey," she shouted, her voice deeper now, carrying authority that hadn't existed minutes before. The giant turned, confused, staring down at the small woman in oversized scrub standing directly in his path. For a moment, it was almost absurd, 5'2" against 7 feet of rage. "Get out of my way, little girl," he growled, taking a step toward her. The floor trembled beneath his weight. Elle didn't flinch. Didn't retreat. Didn't blink. "I can't do that," she said evenly. The giant raised his fist. A blow heavy enough to crush bone came hurtling toward her head, moving with the unstoppable force of a wrecking ball. Somewhere behind her, Dr. Reynolds squeezed his eyes shut, unable to watch. The impact never came. At the last possible fraction of a second, Elle stepped forward instead of back, slipping inside the arc of the swing. It was a move that defied instinct. When a monster attacks, you run. Elle Bennett stepped in. And in doing so, she revealed that the rookie everyone underestimated was something else entirely. The massive fist whistled past Elle Bennett's ear, close enough that the rush of displaced air lifted loose strands of her hair. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to motion and timing. She was inside his reach now, closer than anyone in the ER thought possible, close enough to smell him. Sour sweat. Metallic blood. The sharp, chemical sting of methamphetamine leaking from his pores. Elle didn't hesitate. She pivoted on her back foot, movement smooth and practiced, and drove her right elbow upward with every ounce of force her body could generate. It slammed into the giant's solar plexus, the dense knot of nerves just below the sternum. Thwack. The sound was solid, ugly. A hit that would have dropped a normal man to his knees, gasping for air. For a split second, the giant stumbled backward, confusion flickering across his blood-smeared face as he looked down at his own chest, as if trying to understand what had just happened. Then he straightened. The drugs flooding his system dulled the pain, wrapped his nerves in a false armor. His confusion hardened into rage. His lips peeled back from his teeth. "You hit me," he rumbled, voice low and murderous. "You little gnat." Elle didn't answer. She was already moving again. "Brenda," she shouted without looking away from him. "Clear the trauma bay. Get the patient out the back. Now." Brenda froze for half a second, her brain struggling to reconcile the sight in front of her. The rookie nurse giving orders. The giant standing still. The impossible balance of power shifting in the room. "Move." Elle barked. It wasn't a request. It was command. Brenda snapped out of it. She grabbed the gurney and began hauling it backward, wheels squealing as the overdose patient was rushed toward the rear doors. The giant saw it happen. His head snapped toward the movement, eyes blazing. "No," he roared. He lunged, reaching out with a hand the size of a shovel, fingers stretching toward the gurney's rail. He was too fast. Too strong. He never made it. Elle intercepted him mid-stride. She grabbed his wrist, her small hand disappearing against skin thick as a tree trunk. To anyone watching, it looked ridiculous, even suicidal. She couldn't stop him by force. She knew that. She didn't try. Elle dropped her center of gravity, stepped across his path, and pulled with his momentum instead of against it. It was pure physics, a lesson burned into muscle memory long before nursing school. His forward drive worked against him as she twisted her hips and redirected his weight. For a fraction of a second, gravity seemed to lose its grip. The 7-foot giant left the floor. His eyes went wide with genuine shock as his feet lifted, his massive body rotating through the air. Then he hit the linoleum with a thunderous crash that rattled metal trays and shook the walls. Instruments clattered. The sound echoed like a car wreck inside the ER. Dr. Reynolds stared, mouth hanging open. He had forgotten to be afraid. Elle didn't celebrate. She backed away immediately, hands raised, breathing controlled. She knew better than to assume it was over. With excited delirium, pain meant nothing. Trauma barely registered. "Stay down," she ordered. The giant rolled onto his side, growling, blood pouring freely from his nose now. He pushed himself up, slower this time, but no less dangerous. His gaze locked onto Elle, not with blind rage anymore, but with something colder. Curiosity. He reached down and wrapped his fingers around a bolted four-pole. With a wrench of impossible strength, he ripped it free from the floor. Screws shrieked as they tore out of concrete. He lifted the 6-foot metal pole like a baseball bat. Elle's eyes flicked across the room, calculating. "Okay," she whispered to herself. "Plan B." The giant swung. Elle ducked, but not fast enough. The heavy metal base clipped her shoulder with a sickening crack. Pain exploded down her arm, white-hot and blinding. She cried out, stumbling sideways as her left arm went instantly numb. She hit the wall hard and slid down, gasping, vision swimming. "Got you," the giant sneered, lifting the pole again for a killing blow. Elle looked up at the rising metal, chest heaving, knowing with chilling certainty that she couldn't take another hit. And still, even then, her mind didn't panic. It planned. Because Elle Bennett had been beaten before. And she was still standing. Pain blurred the edges of Elle Bennett's vision as she slid down the wall, her injured shoulder screaming every time she tried to move. The giant loomed over her, four-pole raised, his shadow swallowing the light. One clean strike to her head and it would be over. Not just for her, but for everyone else in the ER. She forced herself to breathe. Fast panic would get her killed. Slow thinking might not. Her numb left hand brushed against the oversized pockets of her scrubs, fingers grazing hard plastic. Trauma shears. Every nurse carried them, heavy-duty scissors designed to cut through denim, leather, even coins in an emergency. They weren't meant to be weapons. But tools became something else in the right hands. As the giant brought the pole down, Elle didn't roll away. She surged forward from her crouch, exploding upward with the last of her strength. The metal smashed into the wall behind her, shattering plaster where her head had been a split second earlier. She drove her good shoulder into his midsection, not to hurt him, but to get inside the arc of the swing. Now she was pressed against his chest. His hands fumbled, surprised by the sudden closeness. Elle grabbed his collar with her numb left hand, gritting her teeth against the agony, and with her right, she jammed the blunt handle of the trauma shears up under his jawline. She targeted the soft point beneath the mandibular angle, a pressure point used to subdue violent patients. She drove it in hard. The giant gagged, eyes watering, a wet choking sound tearing from his throat. The four-pole clattered to the floor. For a moment, it looked like it might work. Then his hands closed around her neck. They were massive, iron bands crushing inward. He lifted her clean off the ground. Elle's feet dangled uselessly as her windpipe compressed. Black spots danced in her vision. The ER faded into a distant, high-pitched whine. "You fight good," the giant rasped, his ruined nose inches from her face. "But you're too small." Air vanished. Elle clawed at his wrists, but it was like scraping granite. Her strength was draining fast. As her vision tunneled, a single thought cut through the haze. "I'm going to die here." Then, unbidden, a memory surfaced. Not nursing school. Not the ER. Sand. Heat. A rucksack digging into her shoulders. A sergeant's voice cutting through exhaustion and fear. When you're being choked, he barked, you don't pull away. You attack the source. Break the lever. Elle stopped fighting his hands. She let her body go slack for half a second. The giant, thinking she was losing consciousness, loosened his grip just enough to adjust. That fraction of movement was all she needed. Elle swung her legs upward, locking them around his waist. Using her core, she snapped her body upward and slammed her forehead into the bridge of his nose. Crunch. Cartilage collapsed. Blood sprayed. The giant howled and dropped her. Elle hit the floor hard, rolling away and sucking in air like it was her first breath. The giant staggered blindly, clutching his face, backing into a tray of surgical instruments. Metal clattered across the floor. Then the doors burst open. Police. Drop it. Get on the ground. 2 officers stormed in, guns raised. The giant turned toward them, blood streaming down his face, rage reigniting. Do not shoot, Elle croaked, forcing the words past her shredded throat. Oxygen tanks, behind him. The officers hesitated, eyes flicking to the cart of compressed oxygen directly in the line of fire. One bad shot and the entire ER wing would go up. The giant charged anyway. Elle didn't run. She scrambled to her feet and hurled herself forward, sliding across the floor and slamming into the lead officer's legs just as his finger tightened on the trigger. The gun went off. The barrel jerked downward. The bullet tore into the linoleum instead of flesh, or oxygen tanks. Chaos erupted again. And in the split second of confusion, Elle Bennett realized the fight wasn't over yet. It was only changing shape. The first thing Elle Bennett noticed was the silence. The ER was never silent. Even at 4 a.m, there was always something, the hum of machines, the squeak of shoes on linoleum, the distant moan of pain echoing down a hallway. But this silence was heavy, sterile, pressing down on her chest. She opened her eyes. White ceiling. Soft lights. The steady beep of a monitor beside her bed. She wasn't in the emergency room anymore. Pain rushed in the moment she tried to move. Her left arm was immobilized in a sling, a deep, throbbing ache radiating through her collarbone. Her right wrist was wrapped and splinted. Her throat burned every time she swallowed, as if she'd scraped it raw on broken glass. Easy, a familiar voice said. Elle turned her head slowly. Brenda Miller sat in the chair beside the bed, no clipboard, no sharp edge to her expression. Her hair was slightly disheveled, makeup smudged, a lukewarm cup of cafeteria coffee clenched in her hand like she'd forgotten it was there. Brenda, Elle croaked. You've been out for 6 hours, Brenda said gently, standing to check the 4-line. Concussion. Hairline fracture in the clavicle. Severe wrist sprain. And bruising that looks like you went 10 rounds with a freight train. Elle managed a weak smile. You should see the other guy. Brenda's face darkened. I did. Marcus Thorne's alive. Coma. Secure ward at Harborview. Doctors say he'll live. She paused. But he's never walking free again. The door opened quietly. Dr. Reynolds stepped inside. He looked different. His confident posture was gone, replaced by a careful stiffness. A bandage crossed the bridge of his nose. Dark bruises were already blooming beneath his eyes. He stopped at the foot of Elle's bed, hands clasped awkwardly, as if unsure whether he deserved to be there. The police reviewed the footage, he said. Security cameras. Body cams. Elle's heart skipped. Am I in trouble? Reynolds let out a short, humorless laugh. If you are, half the department would riot. He shook his head. You saved my life. You saved Emily. You saved the officers. And frankly, you saved the building. He reached into his pocket and unfolded a piece of paper, the next month's schedule. One word had been crossed out beside her name. Traveler. In its place, written neatly in pen, was staff nurse. With charge pay, Reynolds added quietly. If you want it. Elle stared at the paper, exhaustion washing over her. I'll think about it, she said. But right now, I really want some Jell-O. 6 weeks later, she walked back into St. Jude's on a rainy Tuesday night. The glass doors had been replaced. The floor polished. Only faint scorch marks near trauma 1 hinted at what had happened. Big Mike stood at the security desk, jaw reinforced with titanium. When he saw her, he stood and saluted. No words. None were needed. The ER felt different now. When Elle logged in, conversations quieted. Dr. Reynolds nodded to her with respect. No jokes. No whispers. A new nurse hovered nearby, young and nervous. They call you the Titan Slayer, she whispered. Elle adjusted her scrubs. No, she said calmly. I just did my job. She handed the nurse a pair of gloves and turned toward the trauma bay. Because heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes, they wear oversized scrubs and stand their ground when the world breaks apart.